All right, here we go. Lesson number 2 on figures in the landscape. We're going to start off with doing some sketches of our photo reference of our one person. I'm going to show you, I have a measuring tool that's not a skewer. It's an inexpensive tool that you can get on Amazon. I think mine was $10 and it is rather cheaply made, but it does the job. I know they have expensive ones and such for drafting, but we don't necessarily need that. I don't use it often, but it has come in handy every now and again. So I'll start with showing you guys that and we'll do some sketches together. I'm going to switch to my webcam. Okay, so there's my weird printout. Please ignore the lines if you can. So let's see. It's so long you can't see it. This is my measuring tool. It looks like chopsticks in a way. They open up. It has all sorts of different settings. So this is a nice conversion for when you want to take something tiny and make it larger or vice versa. So when you're transferring information, even buildings, but when you're transferring information of, pets and figures and such, you can use this. So what you do is it takes a little practice to know. I don't know the increments, like the mathematical increments of what each section means, but you just pull it off. The first one is even Steven. So you're just doing a 1-to-1. So if you have it set in the middle, it's an exact replica. And then you can just change it from there. So I'm just going to randomly choose one. I'll lock it back in place. It does take a little practice because just like chopsticks, you have to be able to hold it still. And I'm right-handed, so my tendency is to want to use just my right hand for everything, which is kind of impossible. So you kind of need both hands for a minute so you can make your marks and make some measurements there. So sorry about that. Working with the framer again. Okay, so I have my little person. She's standing here. One thing to note with our photo reference this time, her feet are in the water. So when we talked last week about where the wrists are, is approximately the halfway point for an adult. We don't see her feet. So our halfway line is just a little bit different from where she would be. We just have to pretend we know. But things to note, because reflections, we'll be dealing with reflections on this one too. So to try and determine, sometimes reflections can be a little bit skewed and a little bit longer. So you kind of want to take note of that as we go along. So I have these set. If I do the top of her head to her ankle is here. To make her a little bit larger, now it's here. So I'll just make a couple little markings and then she can fit into there. And so then I can continue on and really just kind of nitpick it on down. So her hat. And then I'm going to take a look at from the brim of the hat to the bottom of her tankini top. Make a little mark there. That doesn't look right though. Hold on a second. I'm going to do that again. So measure and remeasure and measure and remeasure. And let me get her hat again. Okay. So brim of the hat to, and again, this can all be done with the skewer. I mean, this is only, I mean, it is a $10 tool. Oh, that's the problem. I marked in the wrong spot for the bottom of her tankini. It is only $10, but for those of you, sometimes, you know, the skewer can be a bit overwhelming and it's not, you know, quite, doesn't seem right either. It's not, this is a little more exact. Oh, it's bouncing. That's what the problem is. It's like it's kind of opening itself back up a little bit. So when I have the, and then I go to make the mark, if I don't hold it tight, it opens itself back up. Like her skirt seems to be too long. I can't fit all that leg in there. Anyway, so if anybody is interested in this, I'll look up exactly what it's called. I got it on Amazon. And like I said, they do have fancier ones, which I think I would recommend a fancier one at this point, because if this one, see how when as soon as I close it, I let go, it opens itself back up. That's not going to be helpful unless I can specifically squeeze it the entire time. If it's open, it's okay. But for those smaller settings, it's not quite what I wanted it to be. So with these little dots, I just marked off the top of her head to her ankles that are now submerged in water, and then her hat and her tankini and the skirt part. So that's just some sizing things that we can consider. I'm going to grab real fast.
Renee, the tool's called a proportional divider drawing tool.
That would be it. Thank you. Proportional divider drawing tool. It is definitely handy when you have the small photograph. You know, when we did our portrait class and we had those small photographs of people and you wanted to get them to be a larger size, it can certainly come in handy. Then instead of gridding, it could be a different solution to the grid method, because the grid method can get a little messy because you have the grid all over your paper. It can certainly take away that extra mess. Let me grab my dry erase marker real fast. Ooh. I didn't want to start marking up on the image because it's small. I didn't print her very large. Typically, I would do two different prints, two different photo references. I would blow up the person so they fill up as much of the paper as would be allowed per my printer and the image itself, and then have the normal proportion of where that person sits in the painting. But for today, I wanted to kind of challenge myself to the concept of this is all I have, so this is what we're gonna work with. Before I start to fill in where my dots are here, I want to take a look at what we talked about last week. The slant of the shoulders to the slant of the hips and her center line. Oops, I already put the tape on the paper. That's going to be in my way. So just to kind of get started, the overall shape and the tilt of her body is important. And again, observe it. You may not necessarily need to make the markings for it, but you need to know it's there so you can make your proper translation of it. Okay. So now that I have all these lines, I wonder if I can actually use them. Sometimes it's easier for me just to go right into the drawing and then figure out where the mistakes are. But that's time consuming and that's not always necessary. So I'm going to try and use what's here. So that would be the brim of her hat. I'm just going to briefly mark some of the tilts. Yeah, I'll probably start this over. But I have the information and her head's looking down. That was another reason I chose this lovely lady today, was because I thought for our first real painting of a person, it would be nice to not have to worry about facial features just yet. And you can take a note too, where her hands fall. If they are even, my brain wants to tell me that they're not even. They're slightly, one's slightly raised, but not by much. It's very, ooh, maybe not at all. No, they're not raised. So if I really take a look at the fingertip to the fingertip that I can see, they're really not raised at all. So I can make note that this arm, as it's kind of dangling down over here, is not any different. Again, just a very loose sketch of her. I'm not doing much craziness just yet. I made her quite a bit wider than I think she is. But just to get started, before I put any shading in there, I want to see if the gesture of her movement is correct. I'm sure there's some tweaks that I can make in here, but once I start to fill in the shadow and the shading, a lot of the information will correct itself with that. So I'm going to fill in that contrast shadow shape. Most of her arm is in shadow. She's got a lot of shadowing going on based on the time of day. All right. Take a couple of minutes and work on that. I'm going to do it one more time with a pencil and some charcoal, just so I want to start it differently for my own sake, and I'll do it again. Before I start that though, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do some measuring with my skewer, my trusty skewer. And I'm looking at it and it's crooked, I think. So maybe it's not so trusty. Yeah, they're not bad. Okay. So I'm looking at an overall tip of the hat, top of the hat to the bottom of the tankini top and seeing where that amount falls. So that's quite a bit. That's about right. You know, pretending I know where her feet are in the water and the tilt of her head. So that's pretty good there. I want to check the width of her because I thought I made her a little wider than she is. So it's about a third of the total height. One, two. She's not that much wider than I thought she was. So I would just be working on the shadowing and the shading there. So I'm gonna do her one more time in pencil. This is an HB, nothing crazy. Looking at the tilts of the head, how it's facing down. So the brim of the hat, that's something else to kind of look at. The brim of the hat, you can get an angle from the back to the front, and you can work with that angle. Now, of course, some of it's kind of blown out, so you don't necessarily get all the details you think you're getting. So just simplify and use what you can see properly. Check the slant of her shoulder, the slant of her arm as it comes down. It might not be the exact measuring, but just getting the angles alone is a huge portion of figures. Maybe I'm just making her arm too skinny. That's the problem. There's also one of those weird printer lines going through right where her arm meets the top of her bathing suit. So that's kind of throwing me off a little bit. Excuses, excuses, I know. So I'm looking at how large to make her legs. That's another thing that we're going to be talking about as we go along today is arms and legs, the spindly little arms and legs, and how to make them, especially on children, how to make the arms and legs look like a full three-dimensional object and not just sticks coming down from their trunks. And that happens really easily because we just draw a quick line with our pastel. And you have one little line. And now it's just the same as a tree trunk. It's the same kind of a thing where you want to have some of those side motions. You're going to go side to side to make a tree trunk, not just linear lines. So we'll be doing a little bit of that with our coloring exercises later. So I'm looking at where her inner thigh hits the tankini bottom, the skirt part, and how that matches up with the V of her top. So if I take a plumb line down from the V of her top, her thigh comes just in of that. So I can start to just get some more information. Don't let your brain get too much in the way like I'm doing right now, because I'm looking at it going, wait a second. Making sure you have enough room. Checking those angles. So this can get a little tricky when you have the calves showing through and how they pop out a little bit, and to make them look like you're not drawing something wrong, meaning, you're not really seeing the back of their calf, but you're certainly seeing the shape of the calf. And seeing the shape of the calf can be a little misleading. I'm blocking in with the charcoal for a second. All my darkest bits and pieces here. Her legs and the top of her head here have the darkest of the shadows. Her hat creates quite a bit of shadow. And there's 2 dimensions to her shadow, which we'll get into with color in a little bit. But directly under her hat is one dark shadow, and then there's a secondary shadow just under it. Those are the things that make them human. Of course, you just start to intimate her little reflection there for a minute. Take the white. This is just white charcoal. Oopsies. I don't know where that came from. Okay. I'm going to pause the recording for just a second. So keep working on that. You know, when we're doing figures in the landscape, just to reiterate, they're not portraits. They don't have to be exactly that person in the photograph. It just depends on what you want out of it. So if they're just people walking by, as long as they look like properly proportioned, close enough, properly proportioned people, it's good to go. Because usually, unless you're somebody like, unless you're doing a painting like when I showed you Glenn Maxian, where the figures, it's almost like a Norman Rockwell figure, where they're figures, they aren't not necessarily people in particular, but they're a little more developed because they're a little larger within the composition. If we're doing smaller people in a composition, just a gesture of them makes the most sense. And I think that's what a lot of us want to do. We just want to get a sense of people in there, not necessarily a full figure. So get it close enough is good for the painting, because once we add color, it makes all the difference. Take a few more minutes, finish up to where you're happy with at least one of the sketches. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it should have the correct proportions, meaning, you know, the height, her wrist being her center line going from the top down. The tilt of the head is super important on this one because she's looking down. So getting that tilt of the hat is pretty important. So the overall size of her body, like height of her body, and the tilt of the hat are the couple of the most important things about this. So get that. I'm going to pause the recording again so I can set up my easel camera, and I won't be doing the webcam. I'll be doing it standing at the easel next, because we'll be using a little bit of color. So I'll need it just a couple of minutes to get that set up. So keep working. Okay, I'm using the paper that we started to use for lessons from the guys, and then we didn't really use much of it. So that's erased bits there. So we're going to have the next bit of exercises are going to be simplification exercises. Some of you have done these with me in class, where we do an apple in 20 strokes or something like that. It's going to be similar to that. We're going to do the same woman at least 2 times, depending on how I feel about it. By the time we get to the third, we might do it a third. And each time we'll add an allowance of strokes. And I'll demonstrate that first. But what I want you to do in the meantime, get your paper ready, get your reference ready, keep your black and white sketches handy. As a matter of fact, I think I will clip mine up next to the paper, just for reference of, oops, wrong way, just for the sake of value, light and dark. When we simplify things down to black and white, it can help us choose a color. These colors don't have to be exact. We're not doing a full portrait, so we don't necessarily need to match her specific skin tone exactly. We just need to have information that reads as Caucasian skin in light and Caucasian skin in shadow. That's what we're looking for. In these exercises, you are not necessarily limited to color. A lot of times those exercises I make you limit yourself to only 4 colors. But we're going to do whatever colors you feel you need to make her happen. I'm going to do a medium blue, a light blue, something super light for the top of her hat, one really dark color for the shaded skin, a light color for her skin, and then maybe a mid-tone for her skin. So I'm probably going to have only 6 sticks. Okay. I would encourage you to not have many more than 6 sticks, because especially in the first exercises, when you only have a few marks to make, you don't want to be bothered with switching things up. The first step, though, of this exercise, we're going to take a few minutes to roughly sketch her 3 times. So lots of practice on our one person today. So you get to try 3 more times. That way, when we're working on our color, she's already there and we're just filling in the color. So you can do something as simple. If you do like your version, like one of the versions, you can transfer it using tracing paper if you want. Or you can just keep challenging yourself to work on your drawing skills. I don't know why I keep starting with the hat, but I do. And the challenge for me is going to be to not fill in too much of that value information and to keep it a simple line drawing. Because I like to get all scribbly when I'm sketching. One of the exercises that we will be doing, not today, one of our challenges are going to be, we're going to put a person in the landscape without actually drawing them in first, that we're just going to use our mark making and our pastels to just put somebody in there. That's scary, but very worthwhile, because once you start to learn the quick gesture to simply indicate the existence of a person, you can fill a whole beach with people. Brenda, I remember you gave me a photo reference to use when I was doing those 6x6s, and you gave me this photo of Ventnor's Beach and it had like thousands of people on the beach. And I'm like, you are insane. I am not doing that. But in 6x6, I certainly wouldn't do it. But, you know, when we practice things like this, you can do it in a larger format, but, you know, it's simpler to get that information in there. One more time. So the trick about this too, a lot of times, if we're not really aware, you could end up making, like, if you have one error on your drawing and you just keep making the same drawing over and over again. So the trick is to be aware and hopefully not make the same mistakes over and over for your person. Or to start making mistakes because you just want to get them drawn. I do kind of notice that there is a little hint of her nose sticking out in the shadow. I'm not really concerned about that for the sake of our paintings today. I will definitely be grabbing a mid-tone for the skin. There are very specific mid-tone shadows on her. So she's a little bit different on that one. Look at that. She looks like she's hunched over, just standing still. I don't care about that for right now. I'm going to keep going with it. But this is just me not really paying much attention when I do it. But it still works for the sake of a figure in a landscape. She's still a person. She's just standing there looking down versus walking and looking down. Excuse me. Oh, I'm going to pause because. So honestly, they could end up just being siblings walking down the beach, one taller than the other, one slightly more depressed than the other. Looking down. But that's what happens, you know, when I do that often, I'll just kind of let my brain wander and not pay as much of attention as I should. Oh, that's what I did. I tilted the hat wrong. The tilt of the hat makes a big difference too. So I just started to ignore it. And sometimes the repetition, you know, then your brain thinks, oh, I got this. And you're putting in stuff that might be a little bit wrong.
So wrong.
It's so wrong. So, but again, this person, I don't know her. I didn't even see her face. I just saw her looking down as she was walking through. I'm not really that concerned with it. I'll put a little bit of water there since we don't have feet. Make it look a little bit more. I'll pause for a minute. It's almost 10 o'clock. So let's pause, get your sketches in place, take your time, and then we'll start the color part of it. I'm going to start to pull my colors and test some colors out, and we'll start up in a few more minutes. Okay. So now that we have line drawings here, so I have my three, I'll call them the three sisters because they're not identical in any way, shape, or form. But they're close enough, you know. So the first thing we'll talk about is the colors that I've chosen. So she's basically, in my mind, I've simplified her to a variety of blues and her variety of skin tones, because that's kind of all that's there for the most part. I mean, for the amount of space that we have to represent her, that's pretty much it. So I have, it's technically kind of a medium blue, but it's on the dark side of a medium blue, a nice medium blue. a light blue, and then an almost white. It's in the blue family. It's still pretty cool. But that's going to be used for the top of her hat where it's the lightest. And then we have the deepest, darkest shadow skin. It's not black. It's almost black. It's actually, technically it's in the green kind of family. It's from my portrait set. It's a unison stick. Then the next variety of shadow, I usually, especially with Caucasian skin, they have like the rosy kind of orangey tint to it, to that second layer of shadow. There's always just that little bit of extra pink or orange in it. And then a nice, exactly what you would think of a crayon there for skin tone, for Caucasian skin tone. And then this has a little bit of yellow to it, but this will be the brightest of the bright spots where the sun hits her body. So with that in mind, we have 3 drawn here. And the purpose is we're going to get more simple with each one. The first one, we're going to have 30 strokes. The second one, 20 strokes. And the third one, 10 strokes. I was going to work 10 to 30, but I figure it's harder for people to keep things simple. So we'll have pretty much, I don't even know that we'll get to a full 30 strokes for the beginning. But we're going to, in our brains, we're going to simplify and take away what we don't need to the point where we get to just 10. And that is where we build confidence and simply placing people in the landscape and just in their figures themselves. So I will start. I'm going to start with this bottom one, mainly because I think she's bigger than the top one. So if I'm going to use 30 strokes, that's where I'm going to get it. So I'm going to start with the darkest. I'm literally going to count. Every time I pick up the pastel, that counts as 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, that could have counted once. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, what's that? 12. All right, I'm a little generous, so I'm at 12. I'm almost halfway there, so I need to buckle down here. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Woo. Harder than I thought. I'm not going to make it. Maybe. All right, we're going to go to 40. We're going to 40 because I'm not going to make it. It's 20. I haven't even gotten out of her skin yet. So 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. 26, 27. Okay. 28. 31, 32. 33. Make my marks a little bit bigger so I can make it. Oh, I covered up my dark. 34. $35. 36. 37. All right, I have to be really particular now. 38. Sorry, here we go again. 39. Yes, I didn't do her hand over here. 40. All right, so 40 strokes. I will pause. Obviously, I can't count for you, so you can, don't cheat, but you can. To go ahead and do your 40 strokes. It's not going to be perfect. You know, you see little gaps. These aren't fully rendered figures. So, but from a distance, it's a person, there's shadow, there's light, and there's a little bit of motion in there. So that's what I want you to start thinking about, is your values and simplifying those abstract shapes. We do it in the landscape all the time when we start from the beginning. We find the big abstract shapes and get the darkest value, mid value, and the light value. Same kind of thing. It's just a person. So don't worry about it being a person. Just go for it. I'll be quiet so you can count. I won't start throwing out random numbers, I swear. All right, so since I struggled to get it done in 40, getting it done in 20 is going to be interesting. So I've been thinking about my strategy and what I'm going to do differently to simplify it. I haven't even let myself think about 10 strokes just yet because that's a little daunting. But to get to the 20 strokes, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to make larger strokes to fill more space. First, I'm going to also, I went from dark to medium to light with each blue and skin color. So I think this time I'm just going to start with the medium tone for each. So I have that middle blue and the shadowed skin one. Those are the ones I'm going to start with, and I'm going to get a little more information down to start with, and then maybe I'll be able to notch in some more of the extremes. I might lose a value in there. You know, I had 4 values for each set of colors, which I might only get into 3, because if we think about it, I have 8 sticks. That's about 2 marks per stick to get with 20. To get with 20. So the less sticks, the better at this point, right? So let's see, here we go. I haven't looked it up yet. 1. 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. I'm already better off. Let's see. What's more important? Let's get that light blue in there. I'm at 6, so let's go 7. Get the lightest on the blue. See if I can do the hat in 1. We're at 8. 8. 9. Get some of that mid skin. 10. 11. 12. 13. 14. So the next important thing I need to represent is the shadow on her skin. So I'm at 14. I should be able to finish with this way. $15, $16, $17, $18, $19, all right, so I have one more real kind of mark to make, so I'm going to use the darkest blue and get this in there. 20. All right, so I used longer marks, did not lift up the pastel, I simplified it even more. So the first one, I started with the dark and I very carefully notched in all the darks, the dark skin and then the dark blue and then the medium blue and then the light blue. This time I started with the mid-tones and then popped in what was necessary. The only stick that I did not use was my lightest yellowy skin. So she doesn't have the bright pops on her knees and on her arm. Her arm is just one shade over here. But it's still readable as a very simplified human. So go ahead. I'm going to pause the recording. Take your time. Think it out. Think about before you lift up that stick. Think how much information you can get down first and go from there. So I'll give you, it's 10:24. So we have 10 minutes or so, if that, because it's only 20 strokes. So, and you should have your colors already picked. So just take your time and get that. Pause. Okay. So as I said, when the recording was paused, looking from a distance, 40 strokes versus 20 strokes, from a distance, they don't look that much different. So we don't have to fuss and muss about all these little tiny markings if we don't want to. It was definitely a challenge to get the 40, but when I changed my mindset to get the 20, it was a little bit simpler. But it's a big challenge to get it done in 10. So here's what I'm thinking. When you look at your photo reference, here we go again, sorry. And you squint, you just squint at it. You see one blue shape that's like an L. The shape of her bathing suit, that blue is in an L. The light of her body, the front part of the bathing suit and the hat make one line. So we almost have you have an L and then you have a line. And then you have an even darker section that comes off of it. So we're really just going to be simplifying these abstract shapes and color. So I'm going to start with those midtones again. I'm going to try and get that L from the top of her bathing suit down through the skirt. Try and get that bright on just that whole side. And we'll see where we go from there. So my medium stick is first. Again. I'm a little less concerned about straps and things like that for this. 1, 2. Three. Now I can combine. I kind of pushed myself to go up into the hat in one stroke. So I have 2 strokes there and filled in all that information. So that's 2. All right. Get some of that shadow. I do have to kind of separate these. 3, 4, 5, 6. I want to get to the lighter skin tone. 7, 8, 9. I really kind of pushed that. So one leg isn't going to have highlights. So 10. So that's 10. Clearly not as modeled, but still a person, still a figure. It's in 10 markings. That's how far I got in 10. If you were sitting on the beach doing figure sketches, that information would be plenty. And if this person, let's say you're doing a large painting and you've got people going off into the distance, the further off into the distance, the less detail. So this is a perfect example of somebody who's way down the beach and you don't get all that information. You get half the body in shadow, half of it in light. Of course, I would touch this line up a little bit. So I'm just touching that with my finger because I don't like how bright that was up there. Now that makes more sense. I got a little crazy with that light mark up on the front of her. Now she's got that very specific shadow in her L. Those are the same values. Those blues to that dark skin is the same value into the light. So I'll pause again. Think about your markings. Think about those abstract shapes. If you squint, even if you're squinting at like my screen right now, look at her on my screen. What do you see? Not much. You see that really dark shadow across her shoulder from the hat down. You see that little bit of an L of the dark on the blue and the light of the front and the light of the hat and a light streak on the front of her leg. And then it looks like the back leg is almost all in shadow. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's doable if you overly simplify. And again, the further the distance, you don't necessarily need to worry about going so dark because in the distance, things kind of gray down a little bit. So keep that kind of thought process in mind. It is about 10:40. So take another 5 minutes or so, less strokes, less time, and go ahead and do that. Okay, so now's the fun part. Now we're going to actually put our exercises to work in a painting. You may want to consider having doing a thumbnail sketch about what you want in the composition. So this photo reference was taken up at LBI at their at Barnegat Light at the lighthouse. So this is the jetty rocks. This is on the other side. So the ocean's off past the rocks on that side of her. So this is just water that comes in under the jetty rocks. You can exclude the rock or you can keep the rock. That is totally up to you. There we go. So in the purpose of composition, does the rock add any value to you? That's up to you. In terms of actual rules of composition, no, it doesn't really add anything to the painting. But it also does add to this whole diagonal linear kind of feel that's happening with the overall form. It is really difficult with these lines, but we'll have to make it through. So here's the next thing to consider for your composition. How big do you want your figure? Is your figure, technically the figure is kind of the star of the show in this format, but how much water do you want? How much sand do you want? We have a lot of empty sand, not empty, yeah, well, empty sand. There's no people there. There's just little lines of clumped up sand and shells and stuff in the background. So you can maybe chop some of that down. Don't put her too close to the top because then you have a frame and then it ekes down onto her. So I have to decide how big do I want her? Where do I want her placed on my paper? And then that will determine where we go from there. So I think I can go a little bit larger. I don't think she has to be as small, especially because I'm not including the rock. So, you know, if I'm looking at it, I could really have a nice diagonal with the water line in the back, fill the page with water, and she can be hanging out. I can decide, I don't want her in the center. Although she's kind of in the center of this photo reference. So I'll be making up some of the water as we go. So whether I want her on the right or on the left, I think I'm going to put her on the right because that's opposite of what I would normally do. Because I want to be a little different today. Normally I would put her there because she's walking toward here, but now we're going to have her, she's already crossed that bit. There's my pencil. Where's my pencil? So we've drawn her a number of times already today, but that doesn't mean that we're going to get her right this time. So don't forget your rules. Don't forget your rules of how she's shaped versus, you know, the halfway point, the tilt of the head, the angle of the shoulders, the angle of the hips, where her wrists are. We know that we don't see her feet. So we have that little bit of a water line hanging out. So I'm just going to place the water there. That's the water at her feet. Another thing to consider, there's two ways to do figures in the landscape in terms of what comes first, drawing or painting. Depending on how abstract you want your people to be. It's kind of like clouds, in my opinion. You know, when I talk about clouds, if the cloud is somewhat see-through, you paint the blue of the sky first and the clouds on top. If the clouds are hefty and thick and full, then you leave space for the clouds and paint around them. So this is what I'm thinking, because she's not going to be some little notch down the road off to the side. I'm going to draw her in and paint around her and then paint her. If she weren't that, again, if she was off way back here, I could paint the whole scene, then take my stiff bristled paintbrush, knock away some space, and put little tiny notches in, most likely with my pastel pencil at that point. But we'll do one of those, not in this one. This one, I'm going to draw her in, I'm going to paint around her, and then paint her, because Brenda, you asked about pencil lines. So I'm going to have all of her drawn in there and there's going to be pencil lines. Well, since I'm painting up to her, some of those pencil lines are going to be covered with the painting that's around her. And then when I fill her in, they're really going to be covered up. You're not going to see a lot of pencil lines in the final piece.
Okay.
I'm going to place her in first, and then get the water around her. Get my skewer back out. How big do I want her? She can get this. For some reason with this one, I have started with her shoulder every time. So I'm going to continue with her shoulder. I'm going to be a little more specific with my drawing, because this is now we're into the painting and I want a little more information. I don't have to be, the exercises were for understanding and practicing how to simplify. She doesn't have to be so simple in this case. So I can put a little bit more in there. I can make a few more observations about hand and wrist placement. I'm looking at the curvature of her skirt a little more because of the way her legs are moving. We have the one leg in front, it kind of lifts the skirt just ever so slightly. I want to be a little more specific about the motion of her legs. Just so it's a little more real. I don't have to fill in every single line. I can have some gaps in what's happening there, which is what I'm doing. Looking at where her kneecap, so the kneecap on this leg, it's kind of looking down a little bit, and where that lands to the crook in the back of her knee on her front leg. That's some important information. So I've thinned her out a little bit, not much, made her a little bit taller. I can, at this point, block in some of that shadow information so I don't lose it in the painting process. This is what I would typically do anyway, blocking in some of the shadows. Not a whole lot. I mean, I don't have to fill the paper, but I can just kind of block it in there because I'm covering the pencil with dark pastel. If I was trying to cover it with light pastel, I wouldn't be putting so much pencil marks down. Now, in some scenarios, this is something new we haven't really talked about just yet. And it's something that you need to observe and decide. In some scenarios, you're going to have a reflection and a shadow. They can be two separate things. So if you look at her, she's got a reflection that goes straight down from her, but because the position of the sun, she has a shadow that goes off behind her. So it looks like just like kind of a dark marking here, but her shadow is behind her while she has a replica of herself in front of her. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes it doesn't really matter much. Sometimes it is one and the same based on the placement of the sun. But this is the end of the day. She's got that extreme light coming from this side with an extreme shadow. So the shadow of her is behind her, while based on the position that I'm standing, the reflection is in front of her. That can change. You just need to observe. I'm excluding the rock. I don't want the rock in mine because it doesn't really add a whole lot. I'm just giving some indication of the water's movement. There's this little wave up here. It's a very low wave because again, this is behind the jetty rocks. And there's a couple of different motions of water in there. So all up behind her is sand. You can change her location at any time. You can make it, you can have a dune behind her because there definitely was dunes up there. You can give her a skyline, which could be kind of tricky in terms of how that works out and where she would really be. Or you can move the wet sand up higher, so you have less dry sand to deal with. All right, so take a few minutes. It is 11 a.m. I'm going to pause the recording. All right, so it has been decided. We're going to discuss how this gets started and finish up on our own. And then next week we'll start with, I'll go over, I'll show you my painting and talk about some different things. And we'll talk about our paintings, and then we'll start something new, probably more of a cityscape. So in this scenario, I very rarely go with the wet underpainting. I almost always will do a dry under, like the first layer being a dry layer and using pipe insulation. I do not want to fill the tooth very fast, especially around the figure. I will work around the figure first and then push to the outside, get everything settled, and then carve her in. It's easier to tighten up the lines on her than to tighten up the lines on the background. So this small space in between her legs is always really difficult because you want to make sure it's the same flow of what's behind her. That's always a challenge when you have legs in a walking motion. You have just that tiny little space in between, and you don't want it to look like it's something separate. So we've got the green in the water and the blue in the water. Of course, I'm guessing because my printout sucks so bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with, this is a little bit of a gray blue. So I'll start with information around her. I raised the wet sand a little bit. So I make gentle notches up to her. I'm going to get some different blues in there. And I go right up to those pencil lines.
You're recording this, right, Renee? This part?
Yes, yeah, this part's recording.
Great.
So I go right up to those pencil lines and place her in that. So I'm oversimplifying at first. right? And she can be a little bit choppy in there because like I said, we're gonna tighten her up with the lines after the fact. I'm gonna get some of that green in there. That lovely green. So this is, very tight mark making. Still trying to keep a little bit of motion in the water. And of course, you got to be a little careful with some of your color choices because she got a blue bathing suit on. And so those medium blues are going to be similar to the blues we see in the water. Let me get a little bit of darkness underneath. This is more of a navy than the first blue I started with. It's a little bit darker, but I want to have the room to get into the light. So I can pretty much get all up around her that way. Now I got to think about the sand behind her. Hadn't really picked out a sand color just yet, but let me see what I can find. This one's a little bit darker, but I'll be putting that lavender in there for the wet sand. There we go. That wet sand always has that little bit of lavender in there, which is fun to play with. So I'm kind of rushing a little bit just to get that information around. So, and behind her head, the sand is a little bit darker. We can still lighten it up, but this first coat so that's a big part of how I would start, right? So that's my dark layer, right? Oops, I used that one. So I've got some pipe insulation. And the same kind of thing, I'm going to go right up to her and I'm going to pull so I can set it in place. Because that's, again, that's the kind of tricky part. Now I got to get in between. If you go a little bit into the skin, it's okay. As long as it's a thin coat, then you can still see where her arms and legs are supposed to go. You might have to do a little bit of drawing again. So this is always how it kind of starts. I'm going to develop all of the water and the sand and finish with the figure. It's a little tedious when you finally get up to her. So when you get all of your water information in and the flow of the water, how you want it, then you slow down and bring it up to the edge of her. Same with the sand. You're going to get all that information. Now you've got the darker sand into the highlighted sand. Slow down when you get up to her. And then if there's a little bit, like I said, if there's a little bit that goes into her, that's totally fine because you're just going to take in and you'll carve right on top and she'll pop out of the water.
And when do you put the reflections in? After you've put in all the water?
It's gonna kind of go hand in hand, but yeah, do the water first, but the reflection is kind of part of the water, so you'll probably get a little bit of that information in there. And the same with the shadow, it's all a part of the water, so it doesn't necessarily have to be in any specific order. It can be while you're working the water, or it can be after. Because it is the water, it's a part of the water, so nothing has to sit on top of one another. You know how we, talk about things sitting on top, it's within. So, and it doesn't have to be specific. This reflection of her is not it's not still water. So it can just be little squiggles of the colors that are on her. Okay. And if you get stuck during the week, feel free to email me, call me, text me, show me where you're at, and we'll figure it out. I'm teaching down in Seattle tomorrow, so I won't be working on this until Thursday or Friday. Hopefully I'll get it finished and I'll send you guys the image of this finished along with the next week's photo by Friday. That's the goal. Okay. So are there any more questions? No? Okay. All right, well, we will end here. It's about 11:20. Again, just take your time when you get up around her. And just, keep it slow. And you can always, when you mess up, you can always take your stiff bristled paintbrush, wipe it away. You can even erase down, just like always. It's never permanent, so don't worry too much. All right. All right, stop the recording.